It's Monday, the 14th of November. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Siobhan Bailey, Labour MP Chris Bryant, comment editor at City AM Sasha O'Sullivan and Guardian columnist Raphael Behr. Today,
I think there are some significant gains for both the French and the UK authorities.
Unfortunately, this new deal falls far short of what is needed to tackle the small boats crossing.
100 more officers patrolling the beaches. The price tag increases to more than £60 million. But will it work?
We are going to see everyone paying more tax. We're going to see spending cuts.
The Chancellor on the horrible decisions coming on Thursday.
I guess the difference between Labour and the Conservatives is that the Tories keep coming back to working people and asking them to pay more.
There was a time when I was really struggling after my daughter was born.
Becoming dad. Is there enough support out there for fathers? Let's start with the city of Kherson, newly liberated on Friday, in fact, from Russian control. You can see here scenes of jubilations, Ukrainians running out onto the streets, welcoming Ukrainian troops. It's the first time they've entered the city of Kherson since Russia began its occupation of the city in March. It prompted this article and headline in the New York Times. We can take a look. Top US general urges diplomacy in Ukraine while Biden advisors resist. This is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley. My opening question to you all is this the right time or a time that they should try a negotiated settlement? Siobhan.
Well, the Prime Minister is very clear that the support is going to continue to the Ukraine. He was on the telephone to President Zelensky on Thursday last week. The most important thing, in my view, is that it's Ukraine that tells us at the point that they want to negotiate. It is their people that are dying. 100,000 troops have been killed, 40,000 civilians. You know, it has to be them that come forward. But in the meantime, they've got steadfast support from the United Kingdom. I mean, yesterday we had a remembrance service in Stonehouse in one of my towns, and the Ukrainian refugees there brought flowers and laid flowers instead of a wreath, and there was a spontaneous round of applause. So we can all join in the celebrations for Kherson, but equally it is for President Zelensky to give us the guidance. We're advisors, we're supporters, we're critical friends at times, but it's for him to give the guidance.
Do you agree with that, Chris, or do you think this is a moment that it could be discussed? This is a top general in the US saying that this could be used as a prime time while people are celebrating the liberation of Kherson, obviously a major blow to Russia, that perhaps that is the only way in the end that this war will be over.
I don't think there should be any negotiation until such time as every Russian troop has left. They're an invading force. And actually, the real danger is that we make the same mistake now that we made in 2014, when we basically let Russia get away with seizing large chunks of Ukraine. Russia had signed up to the Budapest Accords in 1994, which protected the territorial integrity, guaranteed the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And we just said, oh, you're very naughty, but do carry on. And actually, I'm a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. We went to Kramatorsk in February, just before the second round of invasion, and we were right at the front line. We saw Russian troops, sniping at Ukrainians in tiny little villages, and that's been going on in Donetsk and Luhansk ever since 2014. So I think it'd be a terrible, terrible mistake. I completely agree with Siobhan, that the UK and the West has to maintain its strong support for Zelensky. But secondly, the only person who can make a decision about whether they want to negotiate is President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people.
Sasha?
Yeah, I agree with both Chris and Siobhan. I think any diplomatic talks have to reaffirm the sovereignty of Ukraine, and that has to be the starting point. I think that there will be more pressure, I suspect, over the winter on Western governments to pursue diplomatic endeavours. as the energy crisis becomes even worse, as households suffer, and the support that we initially saw, the complete outpouring of support, which I think is absolutely still there in Britain, but there will be a lot more pressure on politicians to try and engage in talks. But the starting point for anything has to be the sovereignty of Ukraine.
Raphael?
Yeah, we've got a kind of consensus on the panel here on this, but I'd add one.
It's not a bad thing.
I'd add one thing on that. Really, that you have to. It's almost a nonsense to talk about negotiations with the Putin regime. I mean, you have to understand the character of that government. You know, I speak Russian. I monitor some Russian state television. It's complete. Incitement to genocide passes as normal punditry on the Russian equivalent of this program that we're on here. And this is, there's no good faith negotiation. Chris is absolutely right. This is a regime that was essentially leafing through a sort of a fascist playbook, more or less cribs directly from the 1930s, saying, oh, we have some citizens overseas, these are ours, we'll make a territorial claim on them, we'll move in with military force. I don't understand what settlement you could have with those troops still on that territory that isn't a variant of appeasement. It's not a real negotiation on those terms, and that can't start until either there's some kind of regime change in Russia or the character of the Putin regime has completely changed.
It's exactly the same as Czechoslovakia in the 1930s, to my
mind.
It is, yeah. But, I mean, some of us have been saying it for a long time. One of the things that's really troubling me, I've had communication with James Cleverly. You may remember that Abramovich surrendered his £3.5 billion when he sold Chelsea, which is back in May. That money's meant to be going to Ukraine and could, frankly, be spent in Kherson now, because there are people with no food, no electricity, no heating, no medicines. But for some reason, it's stuck in a bank account here in the UK still all these months later, and it may not be for months yet.
Can I just add one other thing as well? The fact that the Russian troops have pulled out of Kherson, they're sitting on the east bank of the Dnieper. These are commanders whose military doctrine was tested in Syria, where indiscriminately just bombarding towns. How do we know that the tactic isn't to sit on the east bank of the Dnieper
fear, isn't
and
it?
turn Kherson into Aleppo?
Well,
it's way too premature to talk about negotiations.
And that's the fear. I mean, meanwhile, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has landed in Indonesia, in Bali, for the G20 summit. Here he is, being greeted there, welcoming committee, as expected. And we can hear from the Prime Minister.
Well, I'm going to use this opportunity to unequivocally condemn Russia's hostile and illegal war in Ukraine. And I know that other allies will as well, because it's right that we highlight what is going on and hold Russia to account for that. And I won't shy away from doing that.
Well, that's interesting that he's not going to shy away from it, because, of course, the foreign minister, the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, we can see him here, he arrived a bit earlier, ahead of Rishi Sunak. He's there, of course, in place of the Russian President Vladimir Putin. It is reported that the communique at the end of the Bali summit may get watered down to make it slightly more palatable to Russia, which begs the question, does it make the whole thing pointless? But, Siobhan, Rishi Sunak says he is going to raise these things, say these things. What else would you like to hear him say if he comes across Sergei Lavrov?
Well, I think he's got to be strong, as he is being, and he's got to be very clear that the UK, as part of, we put 2.3 billion quid in military support, like 95 ambulances. We've got to be clear that will not stop, and that Russia is not just fighting Ukraine, fighting the West as well. I mean, one of the great things that the UK has done is training Ukrainian troops. I think it's 10,000 Ukrainian troops every 120 days. So I think Prime Minister has a great lot to be strong about and go and talk to whoever on this subject.
Would it be better to have no communique at all, Chris, rather than a watered-down one?
Well, I think if India and some other countries who you would hope might be more supportive are going to push for the watering down, then I think we need to have a bit of a row with some of our closest international allies. Of course, everything that Siobhan says is great. I support all of that. However, I think, and in the end, the only criminal in all of this is Putin. But I do just want to say that Georgia was 2008. We've known what Putin's territorial ambitions and the way he uses excessive violence We've known about that for such a long time, and yet we kept on inviting people into the UK, Russian money. We did nothing about tidying up the laundromat of dodgy Kremlin money in the UK, and I think that helped embolden Putin. So I'm very critical, I'm afraid, of Sunak personally, because he was very resolute that we shouldn't tackle the dirty money in the City of London.
Of the sanctions that we've got to tackle exactly what you're saying, there's £980 billion of global assets under sanctions. We've got...
Yeah, but we did them far too slowly. Sorry, Siobhan.
The work is done. There has to be constant review and constant implementation of these things.
The work is not done. We sanction 20% of the number that the United States of America sanction. We're nowhere near strong enough on this.
All of the government is committed to using every tool to try and tackle this war, and that is part and parcel.
But do you agree it has been too slow?
No, I think...
in terms of trying to clean up, as they say, money that's come into the country.
Cleaning up decades and decades of work will always take time, but I don't think it's right to say the government hasn't acted or is not
We're still giving out Tier 1 visas.
We're going to move on because I'm going to show you pictures of Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary. She is in Paris. She has been meeting, as you can see there, the French Interior Minister, her counterpart. They have signed what James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, called an update of an agreement. This is to tackle small boat crossings more effectively. £8 million more to be spent on 100 or so more French officers patrolling the beaches in order to try and catch some of the people smugglers and the boats before they actually set sail. And there are going to be more British officers and staff working in the control rooms. Let's talk to Sophie Pedder, who is the Economist Bureau Chief in Paris. Sophie, is this going to work? Will it have any significance?
I think the first point is that it's been signed. You know, this is really important, that the two sides can actually sit down, talk to each other, have a sensible conversation and sign a deal is already one step forward. That's something that hasn't happened before. So I think that's the first point. I mean, the second point is that nobody thinks this is going to solve everything. You know, you just have to look at a map of France and see that you've got over 100 miles of beaches that migrants and traffickers of migrants rather have been using to set them off in the small boats. It's incredibly difficult to patrol that with the best will in the world. And therefore, you know, unless you really attack the problem at source, that is concentrating on the trafficking networks, you aren't going to be able to do it with an extra 100 policemen from France. But I do think, you know, nonetheless, it is important. The French have accepted the idea, the principle that they will have UK policemen sitting in on their operations in France. That's already quite a concession. So I think, you know, one has to at least give it a chance to see whether it can help at least to sort of curb the numbers and sort of bring down calm the rhetoric that has poisoned this whole affair.
Stay with us, Sophie, while I talk to the other guests too, and you can listen to the discussion. I mean, do you agree there that it isn't going to change things overnight? And yet the Conservative government, various iterations of Conservative governments, have promised to tackle this issue, and in fact it just keeps getting worse. So, I mean, what is £8 million more going to do, and more officers? It's not going to completely solve this issue, is it?
Government's got to try everything. The public expect us to try everything as well. They're worried about this. They're worried about the numbers. It's not sustainable for 30 to 40,000 people to come over the channel, notwithstanding how dangerous that is. But this is, you know, the Home Secretary is also going to Frankfurt. I think it's welcome that there are changes. I think having UK police working in France with the French police is really important. But ultimately, we've got to try it. We've got to do processing. We've got to look at legislation. We've got to look at all aspects.
People might ask why that hasn't been done up until now, but how significant do you think this is, Raphael?
Well, it's obviously progress that you can have a kind of base, you know, a first base of diplomatic exchange between the UK and France. You know, this should have been going on all year. It didn't, you know, we know why it didn't. We didn't because you had first Boris Johnson and then Liz Truss, who simply weren't in the business of functional, normal diplomacy with a country, France, that very obviously should be a key ally on this stuff. So great, congratulations for having sort of developed normal conversation and diplomacy. You know, and then you can start having the conversation about, well, why are people coming on small boats? Because you've shut down all the legal routes for migration. You know, everyone sitting around this half a table has probably been through 5, 10, 15 iterations of anxiety verging into panic about different forms of migration and different ways of talking about asylum seekers and refugees, the conflation of asylum and economic migration. We've been through Brexit, the function of which was to take control of borders. We're back here again. We've cycled all the way back around to this. Can we please, as Sophie Pellet, I think, absolutely rightly said, just now have a different conversation, a more rational conversation about managing the routes, what are the criteria for entry, processing asylum claims in a humane, speedy way so that actually you distinguish who's the legitimate claimant, who gets asylum, who doesn't. At least we're not talking, at least in the last few minutes, we haven't talked about packing people off to Rwanda. I'm sure it'll be back soon enough. But yes, we're having a sensible conversation for a moment. Muzzle tov, everyone.
Congratulations, Siobhan.
Listen, so I think you can add in the French elections into that. So there's been a range of different barriers to getting stuff done, and
so
I think
you still see the French as the main
issue.
issue?
I think it's realistic to think that it's always going to be far more sort of difficult for the UK to come to arrangements with France to stop people coming over than it is to have agreements. So I don't think that it's wrong to be down on this. I think it's right to be very, very clear that we have to try absolutely everything. That's deterrence, and we have to look at the people smugglers because they are exploiting people when they get here, and we know that France is a safe country, so it's right to have these agreements where they arise.
Chris?
I can't tell you how angry a lot of my constituents are about all of this, because they say, the government's been there for 12 years and it's got systematically worse. We now have even the Home Secretary is admitting that the asylum system is broken. Well, who broke it?
But do you welcome this as progress?
Yes, but it's not a plan, is it?
It's
a tiny part of a plan, because what you need to do is, first of all, you've got to go right to the source, as the lady said earlier on the programme, which is you need to make sure more people stay in their home country. Secondly, you need to have a really serious attempt at tackling all the different parts of the people traffickers, because it's not just one person who takes you from all the way from A to B. It's 17 different bits of that route all the way along, and we simply haven't devoted enough energy to that.
But Labour doesn't have an alternative plan to that either. I mean, I've heard Yvette Cooper set it out, but it's not vastly different that you would think or be guaranteed that it would really close down all these routes and people smuggling.
Well, in the end, of course, it's not helped that we have kept on changing government. What is it, 174 government ministers been sacked this year? That endless churning means that people simply haven't been watching and preparing properly. One thing, when we came to power in 1997... I know, but the Tories...
It was such a long time ago, you couldn't remember. Yes, of course I do.
The Tories had bust the asylum system then. We had thousands and thousands of people waiting to be dealt with through the system, and that is the worst of all possible worlds, both for people who are here and also for ordinary people who've lived here all their lives and want to get on with their lives and simply don't understand why the government has ended up putting people in very expensive hotels.
Labour don't have a plan, and the public don't believe they have a plan. And I think one of the things we have to be clear about is, on the safe and legal routes point, we've had refugees from Syria, Hong Kong, Afghanistan, and now Ukraine most recently. All of that is pressure on the Home Office. This is over the last couple of years. So it's not rocket science to understand that that is a department under pressure, and that we have to throw all options and take all opportunities to bring this to heel.
Chris?
You cut the number of staff in the Home Office, which means that the job is just not being done properly. Successive Home Secretaries were more interested in making sort of ranty speeches about how terrible foreigners are than they were in actually dealing with the real problem on the ground. Right. That's the disgrace of it.
Well, let's talk about the improved relations, certainly between these two. This is a tweet from Rishi Sunak with Emmanuel Macron, the French president. They met at Sharm el-Sheikh, reported widely as a bromance going on. They're friends, partners, allies. Sasha, do you think that's right? They look pretty chummy there.
I mean, it sounds like Rishi Sunak tried to say the word friend about 15 times in the space of 15 minutes. And I think that that's a very good thing. It's clever of him to kind of come in and say, you know what, I'm different, I'm going to have a conversation about this, because it has been this, it's been used as this way of stoking fears and stoking, kind of Brexit sentiment of saying, oh, we hate the French are ridiculous, we don't want to have conversations with them. And to be fair to the French, it's not entirely in their interest to stop people crossing the channel either. But they also don't have the resources. But as long as we're talking about, routes and things, I think is every time, because we used to have people coming through lorries, and now you have more people coming across the channel, every time you cut down on one route, another one pops up. But what you have today, I think it was in the paper, there's 40,000 people waiting between 1 and 3 years to have their claims processed.
Yeah.
Imagine for a moment that if people came over and it took 3 days. I mean, look, I don't know. I understand that if you're a Home Office, in the Home Office, it's incredibly stressful trying to make sure that you're getting the right people and giving them asylum. But that's deterrence. If people know they're not going to be able to come over and stay here, then the people who deserve to be sent back will send back, and they won't come.
The caseload on the Home Office, just in terms of numbers, is definitely much smaller than it is for Germany and France and other European countries. The capacity is the problem there, not the number of cases.
So these are people. They're people.
They are. Well, let's go back to the tweet. Sophie, can I come back to you and say, is it reciprocated? What does Emmanuel Macron, the government in France, think of Rishi Sunak?
I think I detect really a very different tone here in Paris about the Sunak government. And somebody said earlier that it was about the French elections. I don't think that was the problem at all. I think the problem was the Johnson and the Truss government, which led to a sort of complete collapse in trust from the French side, at least, and a sense that France was just having the finger was being pointed at France at all times, and it wasn't possible to have a proper conversation and build any kind of decent relationship. So I do think things have changed. I think that Macron sees Sunak as someone he can probably do a deal with. They are, same generation. They both had a banking background outside politics. I think they're both probably people who look at doing deals. That's how Macron kind of conducts his diplomacy. And so I do think there's a willingness now to sit down and work with the UK in a sort of grown-up way. And, even talk now, there is now a plan for a Franco-British summit next year, which, don't forget, hasn't happened since 2018 when Theresa May was in power. So I think there is a different attitude here. It's not unconditional, but there is a much greater willingness to work with this government for sure.
Sophie Pedder, thank you very much. It sounds, Siobhan, like he's got a new best friend, Rishi Sunak.
Well, listen, whatever works, to be honest. But what we haven't talked about is our coastal communities who are really struggling with the crossings and are really, really worried about this and are worried about public pressure on services. So, if Labour is genuinely dedicated to tackling this problem, then we have to have a realistic chat. Not everybody coming over is a refugee or has a genuine asylum claim. There are economic migrants in there. They are coming from safe countries in some respect. We have to be honest about this. Yes, and not everybody can stay. And certainly it's not affordable nor sustainable to have £7 million a day in hotel bills either.
So you end up having to negotiate with other countries about returns. You also have to get people processed, because otherwise you have no idea whether they are here.
That's not the message we get from Labour when we try and debate this.
What I literally just said.
No. Great to have that with you. But when we debate this, it's all this is an anti-compassion. This is the volley. The volley is not. Let's have a practical approach to getting things done.
Labour. I've sat in for every single one of the debates that there has been on this in the House of Commons, and it is very clear. Yvette Cooper has made it absolutely clear. We have got a plan. I know you're not impressed by it, Jo, but it's your job not to be impressed.
I didn't say it was impressed, but I was just saying there's no guarantee.
Well, I'll explain. First of all, you've got to have proper system of assessing everybody here swiftly. It should be weeks, not years, that an individual is assessed. Secondly, you've got to have a system for returning people who have come here incorrectly. Thirdly, you've got to make sure that you try and make sure that people don't want to leave their home, for whether that's because of war or famine or
that would
or
take some time.
Well,
yeah.
no, but that's what the aid budget should be used for, I think.
All right. Well,
you have to develop. You have to cooperate with all the other countries in Europe to be able to make sure that you are genuinely tackling every single element of the route.
You mentioned budget. We're going to talk about the budget that is coming, the autumn statement that is happening on Thursday. The Chancellor of the Exchequer. We've heard a lot from him actually over the last week or so, setting out his plans for tax and spending. He's been very clear, Jeremy Hunt, about the difficult, eye-watering decisions that he's going to have to make. Let's have a listen.
We are going to see everyone paying more tax. We're going to see spending cuts. But I think it's very important to say that we are a resilient country. I think that, as Simon Sharma would say, we've faced bigger challenges in our history in the past. And we're also a compassionate country. So we will introduce a plan that will see us through the very choppy waters that we're in economically, but we'll make sure that we protect the most vulnerable.
Jeremy Hunt there. We already have the highest tax burden, Siobhan, in 70 years. What's the point of the Conservatives?
Well, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister have been incredibly honest. This is going to be a very difficult budget, particularly for Conservatives, because we know that we want to reduce taxes and we want to get out of the way of people's lives.
But that's not going to happen anytime soon.
This is, you know, when I do my big shop, or when I'm around and about in Stroud, people talk to me about the realities of where we are now.
Inflation.
They know that we are in a situation where we've had the pandemic, which was very expensive. They know that free vaccines, furlough, all these things have to be paid for. They also can see that the global headwinds in relation to the war and the reality of what we're dealing with internationally and inflation. So the public understand that this is going to be a very difficult and very tough set of decisions.
Raphael?
There's a very important chapter that you left out there in your account of recent history, which is the Liz Truss quasi-Kwarteng government. Because actually, you know, you can have an argument about what is the fiscal shortfall that has to be filled with tax rises and spending cuts. What is the balance of that? What is the time horizon? You can do that. It might be 5 years, so you push some of the nasty stuff to the other side of an election. But what you're actually trying to do with that fiscal consolidation is reassure markets that the UK is a serious grown-up country that can look after its finances. And the reason you have to do that is because of decisions that a Conservative Prime Minister and Chancellor made in a budget that basically made the UK look like a developing market in the 1990s, not a G7 economy in the second decade of the 21st century. So that's quite an important episode in your otherwise, you know, fair an account of what's gone wrong in the last year.
Mistakes have been made. It's nothing to do with me. But we've got to be honest about the fact that a lot of what we're tackling and dealing with was there before the mini-budget fiasco, in my view, and we've got to be clear that with the public about what it's going to take to get us back on track. You'll hear the Chancellor will talk about stability, he'll talk about growth, he'll talk about protecting the most vulnerable, which is what we've been doing.
Is it going to work?
Many measures.
Sorry to interrupt just at the end there. Sacha, is it going to work, though, politically? Because although Siobhan, echoing Jeremy Hunt, saying mistakes have been made, is Raphael right that it is the sort of almost slavish commitment to the markets that this is about as a result of that mini-budget largely that is going to cause the pain that many people will think, well, maybe I just won't be voting Conservative again anytime soon?
Well, there's two political problems that I think this budget will have. Half is actually that a lot of taxes are going to go up, and Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt are doing kind of contortions to not break the manifesto pledge to bring up income tax by freezing income tax thresholds. I think a lot of people might just think, you know what, be honest about it. We're all going to end up in higher thresholds. We're all going to end up paying more tax. Our incomes are going to go up or go up however much, drag us upwards. So you're going to have that problem of a lot of Conservatives are going to be looking at this thinking, what is going on? Because effectively the taxes are going up. We're just not breaking this specific promise. And then you have, as you say, this sense that, well, this was a mess of your own making. And look, I think it is easy to sit now and say, gosh, this was all Liz Truss's fault, and it was catastrophic. But at some point, you have to just say, how are we going to get out of it? And half of it is we need to fix the economy, and the other half is, as Raphael said, we need to convince everyone else that we're a serious country again.
I mean, Chris, there are indications, strong indications, that the Chancellor is going to increase taxes, as he says, on everybody, but particularly on the better off in the way that Sacha has described. You might find that lots of people are dragged into the higher rate of income tax if he freezes those thresholds or extends them. He's going to extend, the indications are, the windfall tax further. This is all music to your ears.
Well, some of it is what we've been saying for quite a long time. It's our plan. But I tell you that I have a real sense of anger when I hear people say mistakes have been made. It's a weasel term. What they should be saying is, I'm really sorry. Britain is broke and we broke it. It wasn't just Liz Truss crashing the economy in that bizarre nonsense that we had earlier on in the summer. It's actually been several years of it, because there was £37 billion wasted on a test and trace system, which was described by a senior figure at the Treasury as the most incompetent and wasteful project we've ever had. We wasted £9 billion on PPE that couldn't be used, £4 billion on PPE that ended up being burnt. The level of incompetence and waste over these years has been absolutely phenomenal.
All right,
and let me just... One other thing that really worries me is we won't get growth unless we can get more people back into work. We had, before the pandemic came, we had 4.8 million people in the UK waiting for an operation. It's now 7.2 million.
We're going to come on to the NHS,
and there's 700,000 fewer people now working. You need to get more people back into work. That's not going to happen without...
Let Siobhan respond.
I do get angry when I hear Labour rewriting history on the pandemic, because I was in Parliament when we were going through votes, and one of the greatest costs this country has been lockdown, and the fact we shut down the country and swathes of it, and we didn't get any help from the Labour politicians as Conservative backbenchers. They wanted longer lockdowns, and they wanted us to continue and continue. And when I was arguing for various different local businesses to get rid of silly rules, I didn't get help from the Labour government. Yet the reality is the Labour Party,
honestly,
and the Labour
Siobhan,
MPs.
I'm sorry,
but I think it's right. You're going to look backwards. You're going to look at the politics. I get that. That's your job to a certain degree. But what we've got to do is look forward, and Rishi Sunak has got a very good record for this country, looking after the most vulnerable, pulling out of his hat things like furlough, and he's actually got to make some very, very tough decisions with the Chancellor this week, I trust them to do that.
What I really worry about is my local authority. It has an annual budget something like 800 million. It's facing a roughly £50 million hole for next year already, and that's before any kind of cuts.
Yes, and
so some of the poorest communities in the country, I think, will end up paying for the mistakes of very wealthy Conservative politicians, and that is a mistake.
He's going to take a fair approach. There's got to be spending cuts. He's going to take a fair approach and make sure that that those who can bear it will do that.
Well, and if it is the case of the broadest shoulders, as you say, you've been calling for some of that. You've mentioned spending cuts. The National Health Service, as you will have seen in the papers, there are calls for more funding. It may be protected, but what they're saying is an increase in funding. Now, that has got other Conservatives worried, because here, this headline in the Times, Tory MPs call on Jeremy Hunt to spare schools from spending cuts. If not health, then is schools going to be, our schools, I should say, in the firing line for spending cuts? Are they right to be worried?
Well, look, there's a fundamental tension here, which is that there is a political demand from people in this country for public services at a certain standard, schools to operate, class sizes not to get too big, waiting lists not to get too long. The economy hasn't been productive enough to generate enough revenue to pay for that, going back, and for now a couple of decades at least. And there's a sort of almost monomaniac political imperative in the current Conservative Party against tax rises in principle, so you can't actually have a conversation about, even what taxes you should be raising and on whom, because particularly this is the sort of the long truss effect, that there's still this allergy against the very concept of tax rises. Actually, the UK, you said at the beginning of this discussion that the UK has, the highest tax burden it's had for years, but it also has one of the lowest tax burdens of rich economies in Europe, and you have countries like France and Germany and Denmark that have higher tax burdens, but also higher GDP per capita and purchasing parity, because actually their economies work better. You can raise taxes and have a functional economy and pay for public services and have a rise.
And is that the discussion that needs to be had? In the way that Raphael's saying, if people want a higher standard of public services, at the moment you could argue, someone might say that we're paying more, but we're not getting more out of our public services.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of that needs to be an honest conversation about how we raise taxes, what taxes get raised. It's one of the things that came up over the weekend was this idea that council taxes could go up, and council taxes are an incredibly regressive policy.
Exactly.
Who that is not the broadest shoulders bearing the biggest burden. And if you're it's this kind of, Jeremy Hunt was saying there's not going to be any rabbit tricks, but there's a lot of kind of magic that they're trying to pull out and shifting and trying to pull things all over the place to avoid saying we're putting taxes up, but they are going to go up.
I mean, I hope they will do an extension of the windfall tax. I don't know why they've been opposed to it and been ranting and raving at us every time we've mentioned it. I think there should also, incidentally, be a windfall tax on banking and financial institutions, because they're making money hand over fist at the moment. I think you could get rid of the non-dom status. I'd also like to take the charitable status off schools.
Yeah,
so there are taxes that, but you're absolutely right. If the temptation for government will be to say, local authorities, you can make up your money by raising council tax. Council tax is only about 20% of the amount that a local authority spends. That will be a very regressive way, and it would hit poorer communities such as mine.
Well, you were raising your eyebrows during that list.
I just were wondering how long you were going to let a Labour politician list what tax rises that they want and change it. But what
you voted for 15 in the time that you've been an MP.
You're going to get an honest assessment of the country's finances, and I believe that the Chancellor will be very clear about why we're doing it. I mean, I'm one of the Tory MPs that are calling for support for schools. You know, we see so many millions and millions and millions going into the health service. We know that that's absolutely needed, but when schools and head teachers are saying to me we're really struggling to balance these
So is that
books,
a sacred cow for you? No cuts to the schools budget?
I don't think we can have too many sacred cows because we've got to look at it in the round. But ultimately, there are going to be difficult decisions. But you've got a Chancellor and a PM that will look after the most vulnerable while they're making those decisions.
Right, and they're going to do that, they say, certainly reviewing the energy intervention. Chris, I mean, it is true. Let's say you win the next election. Many of these spending cuts may well be delayed until then. What are you going to do? Embrace austerity, or are you going to start breaking the fiscal rules that Rachel Reeves is already setting out and spend on day-to-day?
Well, it's very important that we have a balanced budget. I believe in sound money. You can't spend money that you haven't got.
So you will embrace the spending cuts that are coming?
Well, it's always tempting to try and get somebody who might be in power in 2 years' time. I mean, let's have a general election. We can have a debate about what our plans will be. We don't want the kind of nonsense that Liz Truss gave us.
All right, well, we've done that. We've been there. And actually, Labour did sign up to some of that Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss prospectus that they set out on tax cuts. But we don't have to relitigate it. But let's just remind people. But yes, go on, finish.
Well, actually, we were against the increase in national insurance at a time when we were going into recession, which we're now in. And you voted for it, and then you voted against it. So,
all right, we're going to break off there because I'm going to show you something completely different. Have a look at this video.
There's stuff that you can't talk to your wife about, or even to close family.
It wasn't until Zoe came out a couple of hours later, the midwife said, "Oh, did you see those guys running past?" Yeah, so that they were bringing the blood up. Yeah, it's tough. So I'm still processing that, for sure.
If we want men to really be the dads and be that active, present father in the house, they need help doing that.
And we're joined by the author and presenter of Becoming Dad documentary, Elliot Ray. Welcome to you. Tell us about your own personal experience in trying to access mental health support that you needed after witnessing the traumatic birth of your daughter.
So, my work is all shaped by my personal experience. We had a relatively good pregnancy overall, but my daughter was born with an infection called Group B strep. And when she was born, she was, lifeless. She had to be resuscitated and helped. My wife was also losing a lot of blood, and so it was a very traumatic experience for us both. I went from being a confident, extroverted person to, having panic attacks, crying on the way home from work, really not feeling myself. And I think there's two things I learned from that. The first thing was that it wasn't forthcoming. Mental health support for dads wasn't forthcoming, but also for myself in terms of my eagerness or even accepting that professional support was available to me, that wasn't there either. So it's really gone on to shape my work, and the documentary is all about how we can provide better holistic support for dads going through the maternity process, but also afterwards as well, in relation to properly paid paternity leave and flexible working. How do we support families holistically for the benefit of children, dads, but also for mothers, for women, for the motherhood penalties. There's so many reasons why we should be doing this and focusing on this as an issue in society.
Absolutely. Your experiences obviously shaped what you then did. You set up a website, a support website, Music, Football, Fatherhood, to help others. What's been the response to your campaign and your website?
The response has been brilliant, fantastic. You know, we've written a book which has sold really well. It's telling stories of 20 dads. We talk to dads all the time through community events. You know, we have an event with Arsenal coming up at the end of the month, and we're really getting into the nuances of the dad's experience, which of course is largely joy and the privilege, but also can be really tough. You know, being a new parent, being a new dad can be very, very difficult. We know that 1 in 10 new dads will experience some symptoms of postnatal depression. We know that when it comes to, you know, statutory paternity leave, that leaves most families with £150 per week. A lot of parents and families can't afford to take that up. And we know that can have a negative impact on the whole family unit. So when we're looking at how do we build a society that is fit to raise the next generation, that is fit to go to the workforce and be productive, that is fit and healthy to contribute to society, a lot of the work and the focus we need to be doing on is supporting parents through becoming new dads and new mums. And the programme is all about looking at how we can support dads through the NHS, so holistic support when they find out they're going to be a dad, through the labour room to afterwards, and also in the workplace, and also through community groups as well.
Raphael, do you think fathers are offered enough support? I mean, it's interesting how much is highlighted here by Elliot Ray, and not something that probably a lot of people have thought about.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I absolutely salute what he's doing there. I mean, my children were born 2006, 2008. I was very lucky that the delivery, the labour was all very straightforward, and they had, you know, 2 healthy babies, and you know, I had an employer who was very supportive. I took time off. I had this sort of magical, you know, early stage fatherhood, and so I wasn't exposed to the threat, the anxiety that we've just heard described there. And you know, I can easily see how, you know, if I hadn't been that lucky, I could have just fallen through the cracks. I'm not sure there would have been that conversation and that support. And actually, looking back on it, even then, even in the 21st century, it didn't feel that far removed from the days, the sort of caricature of the dad sort of outside the room, smoking a cigar, pacing up and down, not really involved at all. And the idea that fatherhood, you're basically, your function is discipline and financial provision. I mean, you don't have to go that far back in time to reach that kind of caricature of what a dad is. So yeah, absolutely. I just think it's fantastic. It's a conversation that we have to have, because it'll help mums. It'll help everyone. It's not a zero-sum thing. It's, you know, it's about just, yeah, moving into the 21st century properly and understanding the whole of parenthood, the blended families, the whole of the different ways people manage these relationships.
I mean, Siobhan, one of the issues is deciding how to use or split shared parental leave. Currently, parents can share up to 50 weeks of leave, with 37 of those weeks being paid. But the figures show that shared parental leave currently only has an uptake of 3% of eligible parents, despite the government's target of 25%. I mean, that's...
There's still lots of dads that don't ask for it as well, and just don't feel able to, which is something... Look, we've got two I mean, fantastic work for Elliot, and fantastic to use sport as well, which is where lots of families go together, and particularly for dads. But on the health side, the Gloucestershire Home Start runs something called Dads Matters for mental health for dads, and it's absolutely great. But there was a report out a few years ago saying, for the Fatherhood Institute, was saying, who's the bloke in the room? Because they're just ignored at various different stages of the... And then secondly, society, we need to... I mean, I was doing a range of different events yesterday, and my husband, who's fantastic, took both kids, and loads of people came up to me and said, where are the kids? And I said, oh, where the dad? And they say, oh, that's good of him. And I was like, they're his kids. Of course he's taken them. You know, so, I mean, it's always like, well done, dads, and mums just have to get on with it. So we've got to change that. But you know, I know DWP did a big announcement about mental health support. It's about 120-odd million quid. And I do think that mental health, parenting, stopping family breakdown, getting people early is hugely important to this country.
We've only got literally 10 seconds, Elliot, but I shall tell everybody now, Becoming Dad, the documentary, is on the iPlayer now, or you can watch it live tonight on BBC One at 8:30. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to all of my guests for joining me today. Elizabeth Glinker will be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two in the iPlayer. Bye-bye.